The house had been too quiet since winter settled in, the kind of quiet that made every sound feel intrusive. The stepmother noticed it most in the mornings, when the kettle clicked off and no one called out from the back room. She liked that silence. It meant control. It meant nothing unexpected. When she signed the papers to hire him, she barely looked up. The agency file said he had just been released after several years inside. No family listed. No strong references. That was exactly what she wanted. Someone with nowhere to go. Someone who wouldn't ask questions. She explained the situation in a practiced voice. A disabled teenage girl, limited mobility, quiet, difficult. She emphasized the difficulty. She did not mention that the girl liked astronomy documentaries or that she laughed silently, her shoulders shaking, when she won at board games. He arrived on a gray afternoon, carrying a single duffel bag. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, unsure whether to take off his shoes. He was larger than she expected, rough around the edges, but his eyes kept drifting down the hall instead of settling on her face. That annoyed her. She gestured sharply toward the back room. "She's in there," she said. "She doesn't talk much." When he entered the room, the girl was by the window, her wheelchair angled so she could see the bare branches outside. She turned her head slowly when she heard him, assessing him with a seriousness that didn't match her age. He nodded to her, unsure what else to do. "Hi," he said, softly, as if loudness itself might be dangerous. She didn't answer, but her eyes stayed on him. Not afraid, curious. The stepmother watched from the doorway, arms crossed. She expected indifference. What she saw instead was hesitation, even care. It unsettled her, but she told herself it didn't matter. He would learn. They always did. Days passed, then weeks. The routine settled in. Meals placed carefully on the tray, exercises done slowly, the television turned to whatever channel the girl preferred. The stepmother kept her distance, checking in just enough to maintain the image of concern. She paid him on time, reminded him of his place, and spoke about the girl as if she were a burden, a responsibility that had ruined her life. He listened without agreeing. That alone was a quiet rebellion. He began to notice things. The way the girl stiffened when her stepmother entered the room. The way the pantry was always locked, even though there was no reason for it to be. The way medications went missing, then reappeared. He didn't accuse. He observed. Prison had taught him patience. One evening, while helping the girl with a puzzle, he realized she was spelling something out with the pieces, slowly, deliberately. It took him a moment to understand. Help. He looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something heavy settle in his chest. He had been hired to be invisible, but invisibility had never suited him. Not anymore. He started documenting small things. Dates, times. He made phone calls from the old phone he kept hidden in his bag. He asked questions that sounded harmless. He learned the girl's father had died suddenly years ago. He learned the stepmother controlled everything now. The stepmother sensed the shift before she understood it. She noticed how the girl's posture changed when he was near, how the room felt less empty. It made her uneasy. She began to criticize him openly, to remind him of his past, of how easily he could be replaced. "You should be grateful," she said one morning. "Someone like you doesn't get many chances." He met her eyes then, calmly. "Neither does she." The words hung between them. Her mouth tightened. Something cold flickered behind her gaze. The breaking point came quietly. A social worker arrived unexpectedly, asking routine questions. The stepmother smiled too widely, talked too much. The girl said nothing, but when the social worker asked who helped her most, her eyes went to him. She reached out and took his hand. The stepmother froze. Everything unraveled after that. Records were checked. Concerns were raised. The house filled with voices and movement. The stepmother stood in the corner, stunned, as if she had stepped into the wrong life by mistake. Later, when the house was finally quiet again, the girl was wheeled out into the sunlight, blankets tucked around her shoulders. He walked beside her, unsure what came next, only knowing that it would be different. She looked up at him and smiled, small but certain. For the first time in a long while, the silence felt like relief. The house had learned how to hold its breath. It did so every morning just before dawn, when the radiators ticked and the floorboards cooled, and the silence pressed in from all sides like a weight. The stepmother woke before the alarm, as she always did, and lay still for a moment, listening. No movement from the back room. Good. Quiet meant order. Quiet meant nothing was going wrong. She rose, wrapped herself in a robe, and went to the kitchen. The kettle went on. The same cup, the same spoon, the same motions. Routine was armor. When her husband had died, the routine was what remained, and the girl, his daughter, had been the one variable she had never been able to control. A child who did not fit into neat expectations. A child who required time, patience, money. A child who reminded her, every single day, that she had not been chosen first. When the agency suggested a live-in caregiver, she saw opportunity. Not relief, opportunity. Someone else to shoulder the work. Someone expendable. When she read the file and saw the note about prison, she did not hesitate. People like that did not ask questions. People like that were grateful. He arrived with the weather, a gray afternoon that smelled of melting snow. He stood at the threshold with a single duffel bag and a posture that suggested he was prepared to be told to leave at any moment. His jacket was worn but clean. His hair neatly cut. He did not look like the threat she had imagined, and that irritated her. She explained the rules immediately. Meals at specific times. Medication on schedule. No visitors. No unnecessary conversations. She spoke about the girl as if she were furniture that required maintenance. He nodded, eyes lowered, absorbing it all without comment. When he first saw the girl, he felt the room shift. She sat by the window, light falling across her face in a way that made her look older and younger at the same time. There was no television on, no music. Just her in the outside world she could not reach. He introduced himself, awkwardly, and waited. She did not speak, but she watched him with an intensity that made him straighten his shoulders. He had been looked at before, judged, measured, but this was different. This was attention without contempt. It disarmed him. The stepmother watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. She did not like how long he stayed in the doorway, how he did not rush through the task. She cleared her throat sharply. He moved then, but gently, and the girl did not flinch. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt deceptively calm. He learned the layout of the house, the creak in the third step, the way the hallway light flickered if left on too long. He learned how to maneuver the wheelchair without jarring her, how to wait for her nod before adjusting anything. He spoke to her even when she did not answer, narrating small things, the weather, the news, the taste of the soup he reheated. It felt strange at first, but less so as time went on. The stepmother observed from a distance. She corrected him often, sometimes unnecessarily. She complained about expenses, about how difficult everything was, about how trapped she felt. He listened, but he did not join in. When she spoke about the girl with resentment, he remained silent, and that silence felt like defiance. He began to notice the cracks. The locked pantry. The way food portions were smaller when the stepmother served them. The way the girl's hands trembled slightly when her stepmother raised her voice. None of it was dramatic. None of it would have stood out to someone who wasn't looking. He was looking. At night, when the house settled back into its breath-holding quiet, he lay awake and stared at the ceiling of the small room he had been given. He told himself he was reading too much into things. He told himself he was there to work, not to fix. He had learned the cost of stepping in where he wasn't wanted. But then there were moments that refused to be ignored. The girl's eyes following him when he left the room. The way she relaxed when he returned. The puzzle pieces she arranged slowly, deliberately, forming words when no one else was watching. Help. Again. Please. He felt the old familiar weight of responsibility settle in his chest, the kind he had tried to bury years ago. He thought about all the times he had walked away before, convinced it wasn't his problem. He thought about how that had ended. So he began carefully. He kept notes in a small notebook hidden in his bag. Nothing dramatic. Dates. Missed medications. Comments made too casually to be innocent. He made a call to the agency with a vague question about protocols. He asked a neighbor, politely, if they ever checked in on the family. He did not accuse. He gathered. The stepmother sensed the shift like a change in air pressure. She noticed how the girl seemed more present, more alert. She noticed how the caregiver met her gaze now, how he did not look away when she spoke sharply. It unsettled her. She began to remind him of his past, slipping comments into conversation like small blades. "You're lucky to be here," she said one afternoon, watching him help the girl with her exercises. "Most people wouldn't trust someone like you." He did not respond immediately. He finished the movement, waited for the girl's signal that she was done, then turned. "Trust goes both ways," he said evenly. Her smile tightened. She did not like that he had found his voice. She escalated in subtle ways. Reduced his hours on paper while expecting the same work. Questioned his competence in front of others. She assumed fear would keep him in line. She underestimated the way fear loses its power once you've already lived through it. The social worker arrived on a Thursday, unannounced. The stepmother was unprepared, her composure slightly too polished, her explanations rehearsed but rushed. The caregiver stayed quiet, answering only when asked, his notes heavy in his pocket. When the social worker turned to the girl and asked who made her feel safest, the room seemed to tilt. The girl did not speak. She did something else. She reached out and took his hand, holding on with a strength that surprised them both. The silence that followed was not the controlled quiet the stepmother preferred. It was exposed, raw. Questions followed. More visits. Paperwork. The routine the stepmother had relied on fractured under scrutiny. She watched it happen as if from a distance, disbelief hardening into something colder. This was not how it was supposed to go. She had planned for invisibility, for neglect hidden behind plausible explanations. She had not planned for loyalty. When the decision finally came, it was calm, almost gentle. Temporary removal, further evaluation, support services. Words that sounded harmless but carried weight. The stepmother stood in the corner of the living room, arms wrapped around herself, as if bracing against a sudden chill. She did not shout. She did not cry. She simply stared, frozen, as the life she had arranged so carefully slipped out of her control. Outside, the air was bright and sharp. The girl was wrapped in a blanket, her face turned toward the light. The caregiver walked beside her, unsure of his place now, aware only that something irreversible had happened. She looked up at him and smiled, not wide, not dramatic, but certain. A smile that said she understood what he had risked. A smile that carried trust. For the first time since he had arrived, the house behind them exhaled. And this time, the quiet did not feel like a threat. The house had learned to exist in a permanent state of restraint, like a held breath that never quite released. It showed in the way doors were closed softly but firmly, in the way curtains were always half-drawn, never fully open. Morning arrived without warmth. Even the light seemed cautious as it slid through the narrow gaps and settled on the floor in pale, careful lines. The stepmother woke before dawn, as she always did. Habit had replaced the need for an alarm long ago. She lay still for a moment, listening, not for birds or wind, but for absence. No movement from the back room. No wheels against the floor. No voice. Silence meant success. Silence meant the system she had built was still intact. She rose and went to the kitchen, moving with the certainty of someone who had memorized every step. The kettle, the cup, the spoon, the faint smell of detergent that never quite left the air. She liked things clean, orderly, predictable. The girl had never fit into that. When her husband was alive, he had absorbed most of the inconvenience. He had softened the sharp edges, filled in the gaps she refused to acknowledge. When he died, suddenly and without preparation, those gaps became unavoidable. The girl remained. The responsibility remained. And resentment, long buried, finally had space to breathe. She told herself she was practical. That she was doing what needed to be done. People admired strength like hers, even if they didn't say it out loud. Hiring a live-in caregiver had been an easy decision. Choosing which one had been even easier. The agency file said he had just been released after several years. Minimal family contact. No real support system. The kind of man who would take what he was given and ask for nothing more. She smiled to herself when she read it. He arrived on a gray afternoon, snow melting into slush along the edges of the street. He stood at the door longer than necessary, as if bracing himself. One duffel bag at his feet. No phone in his hand. No one waiting for him anywhere else. She sized him up quickly. He was bigger than she liked, but there was nothing aggressive about him. His eyes moved carefully, taking in details without lingering. That, she decided, could be corrected. She laid out the rules immediately, her voice clipped and efficient. Schedule, expectations, boundaries. She referred to the girl not by name but by condition, by inconvenience. He nodded, accepting it all without interruption. When she gestured toward the back room, he hesitated, just for a moment, before following her. That hesitation annoyed her. The girl sat by the window, her wheelchair angled toward the weak winter light. Her hands rested loosely in her lap. She looked up when they entered, her gaze steady and unafraid. He introduced himself quietly. She did not answer, but her eyes stayed on his face, searching, assessing. Something in that look unsettled him. He had been judged before, reduced to labels and assumptions. This was different. This was curiosity without cruelty. The stepmother watched closely, noting how he adjusted his posture, how he spoke more softly than necessary. She cleared her throat sharply. He stepped aside, but the girl did not look away from him. From that first day, the routine began to shift, though the stepmother did not notice it immediately. He followed instructions, but he also paid attention. He learned the timing of the girl's movements, the signals she used when something hurt or when she was tired. He spoke to her as if conversation mattered, even when she did not respond. The house remained quiet, but it was no longer empty. The stepmother kept her distance, appearing only when necessary. She criticized often, corrected small things, reminded him who was in charge. She spoke about sacrifice, about how much she had given up. He listened without agreeing, and that silence irritated her more than argument ever could. He noticed details that didn't add up. The pantry locked at odd hours. The way meals varied depending on who prepared them. The way the girl's shoulders tensed when her stepmother's footsteps approached. None of it was obvious. All of it felt wrong. At night, he lay awake in the narrow bed of his room, staring at the ceiling. He told himself he was overthinking. That he was projecting his own past onto a situation he didn't fully understand. He had learned, the hard way, that interfering came with consequences. But then there were moments that refused to be ignored. One evening, as he helped the girl with a puzzle, she began arranging the pieces not to complete the picture but to form words. Slowly, carefully, help. His chest tightened. He did not react outwardly. He finished the task, put the pieces away, and smiled as if nothing had changed. But everything had. He began documenting small things. Nothing dramatic. Missed medications, inconsistent instructions, comments that suggested more than carelessness. He made quiet phone calls, asking neutral questions. He learned the girl's father had handled most official matters before his death. He learned how little oversight remained. The stepmother felt the shift before she could name it. The girl seemed more alert, more present. The caregiver met her gaze now, no longer shrinking under her scrutiny. The balance of the house felt altered, and she did not like it. She began reminding him of his past, dropping comments casually, like they were jokes. She questioned his competence, reduced his pay on paper while increasing his workload. She assumed fear would keep him compliant. She underestimated how little fear he had left. One afternoon, as he helped the girl stretch her arms, the stepmother stood in the doorway, watching. "You should remember how lucky you are," she said. "Someone like you doesn't get many chances." He finished the movement, waited for the girl's signal, then turned slowly. "Neither does she," he said. The words landed heavier than he intended. The stepmother's expression hardened. Something cold settled behind her eyes. The visit from the social worker was unannounced. The stepmother smiled too quickly, spoke too much. The caregiver answered questions calmly, his notes a quiet weight in his pocket. When the social worker asked the girl who helped her the most, the room held its breath. The girl did not speak. She reached out and took his hand, gripping it with quiet certainty. The silence that followed was not controlled. It was exposed. What came next unfolded gradually. Follow-up visits, questions, reviews. The routine the stepmother had relied on fractured under attention. She watched it all as if from a distance, disbelief freezing her in place. This was not how it was supposed to go. She had planned for invisibility, not intervention. When the decision came, it was calm, almost gentle. Temporary changes, additional support, words that sounded harmless but carried irreversible weight. The stepmother stood in the corner of the living room, arms wrapped tightly around herself. She did not shout. She did not cry. She simply stared, stunned, as control slipped from her grasp. Outside, the air was sharp and bright. The girl was wrapped in a blanket, her face turned toward the light. The caregiver walked beside her, uncertain of what came next, knowing only that something had shifted beyond repair. She looked up at him and smiled, small, steady, unmistakably real. For the first time, the silence behind them felt like release.